Two Navy fighter jets are climbing off the coast of Southern California, sent to intercept something the ship's own radar operators can't explain. Neither pilot knows what they're about to see. Neither of them will ever fully explain it. Not to their commanding officers, not to Congress, not to each other, not even 20 years later. What happens in the next few minutes will become one of the most scrutinized encounters in the history of military aviation, recorded on infrared, tracked on radar, witnessed by 4 trained officers at once, and never, to this day, fully resolved. The odds of it happening exactly this way, the timing, the location, the convergence of 2 advanced fighter jets and something that seemed to defy the basic rules of flight, are almost impossible to calculate. And yet it happened in broad daylight, in front of witnesses whose entire careers depended on telling the difference between what's real and what isn't. This is the story of the Tic Tac encounter, and the physics that still, decades later, refuses to add up. To understand how strange this really was, you have to start with the week before anyone saw anything at all. In November 2004, the USS Nimitz carrier strike group was conducting routine training exercises in the Pacific Ocean, roughly 100 miles southwest of San Diego. It was supposed to be an unremarkable stretch of pre-deployment drills before the strike group headed to the Persian Gulf. Nothing about the assignment suggested anything unusual was coming. But aboard the USS Princeton, a guided missile cruiser equipped with one of the most advanced radar systems in the U.S. Navy's arsenal, something had been happening for days. Radar operators, trained professionals who spent every shift distinguishing real threats from clutter, weather, and false returns, kept picking up objects that made no sense. Targets appearing at altitudes above 80,000 feet, then dropping to near sea level in less than a second, not diving, not descending the way any known aircraft descends, simply appearing at one altitude and then, an instant later, at another. Kevin Day, the Princeton senior radar operator at the time, would later say his screen showed well over 100 of these anomalous returns over the course of that single week. At first, the crew assumed it was equipment error. Radar glitches happen. Systems get recalibrated. Operators double-check their instruments, and most of the time, the anomaly disappears the moment someone looks closer. This one didn't. The operators cross-checked the readings against other systems on the ship. The anomaly held. By the time November 14th arrived, the Princeton's crew had been watching these objects on and off for the better part of a week. That afternoon, at around 2 o'clock, 2F divided by a -18F Super Hornet fighter jets from a Nimitz, already airborne on a routine training flight, received an unusual radio call. An operations officer aboard the Princeton told them to break off their exercise and proceed to new coordinates for what was described as a real-world task. Then came a question that told the pilots this wasn't routine at all. Were they carrying live weapons? They weren't. At the controls of the 2 jets were Commander David Fravor, a decorated Top Gun graduate and the squadron's commanding officer, and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, flying alongside him with a weapons systems officer in the back seat of each aircraft. For highly trained officers, in total, converging on whatever the Princeton's radar had been tracking, what they found when they arrived was not what any of them expected. Below them, over a patch of churning, whitewater ocean, was a small white object, smooth, oblong, with no wings, no visible engines, and no exhaust plume of any kind. It was roughly the size of Fravor's own F/A-18 by his estimate around 40 feet long. It had no markings, no control surfaces, nothing that identified it as any aircraft, drone, or vehicle any of the 4 officers had ever seen or trained to recognize. Fravor would later describe it simply. It looked like a Tic Tac, hovering just above the water. For several minutes, all 4 officers watched it. It didn't behave like an aircraft under any conventional propulsion. It didn't drift with the wind. It didn't circle or bank the way a plane would. It simply held position over the churn in the water below, a churn that, notably, looked like something was displacing the ocean's surface from underneath, the way a submerged object might. Fravor decided to get a closer look. He began a descending turn toward the object, intending to close the distance and identify it visually. And this is the point in the story where the pilot's accounts, corroborated independently by both aircraft, describe something that no conventional explanation has ever comfortably accounted for. As Fravor descended, the object began to mirror his movement. It didn't flee. It didn't ignore him. According to Fravor, it behaved as though it was aware of his aircraft and reacting to it in real time, rising to meet his altitude as he descended, almost playfully, the way one fighter jet might react to another during a training dogfight. It was aware we were there, Fravor later said. Then, in an instant, it was gone. Fravor described the object accelerating away with a speed and a lack of any visible transition. No afterburner flare, no gradual buildup, nothing that resembled how a jet, missile, or aircraft leaves a hover state. It was simply present, and then it was 60 miles away, reappearing on the Princeton's radar less than a minute later, a distance that, if the timeline holds, implies a rate of acceleration and a top speed that exceeds what any known aircraft in the world, then or now, is capable of sustaining. This is where the physics part of the story actually begins, because from this point forward, the mystery isn't really about what the pilots saw. It's about what would have to be true for what they saw to make sense. A conventional aircraft accelerating to a speed capable of covering 60 miles in under a minute would need to survive G-forces that would kill a human pilot instantly, and would need a propulsion system that leaves no visible exhaust, no sonic boom, no radar signature consistent with any known engine. No nation on Earth, as far as any declassified program has ever revealed, possessed that kind of technology in 2004. And if the acceleration profile described by 4 trained officers is accurate, it still doesn't match anything that's been publicly disclosed today, more than 20 years later. That's the puzzle investigators, and later scientists, skeptics, and eventually members of Congress would spend the better part of 2 decades trying to untangle. The first and most obvious question anyone investigating this kind of event has to ask is the simplest one. Was it actually there? Not in the sense of doubting the pilot's honesty, but in the very specific, very technical sense that instruments, radar, infrared cameras, human eyes, can all be fooled under the right conditions, and ruling that out has to come before anything more exotic is considered. Investigators, and later independent researchers, worked through the obvious possibilities one at a time. Was it a weather balloon? Balloons don't accelerate, don't mirror an oncoming aircraft movements, and don't produce independent hits on both shipborne Aegis radar and separate airborne radar systems simultaneously. Was it a drone, a classified U.S. program, or a rival nation's aircraft testing American defenses? Possible in theory, but nothing in the years since. No declassified program, no whistleblower account, no matching hardware has ever surfaced to support it. Was it a sensor glitch, a radar artifact appearing simultaneously across multiple independent systems, tracked by different crews, on different ships, on different days that week? That explanation gets harder to sustain the more corroborating instruments you add to the picture, and this case had an unusual number of them. That combination is exactly what separates the Tic Tac case from the vast majority of UFO reports. Most sightings give investigators one thing to work with: a blurry photo, a single eyewitness, a light in the sky with no other corroboration. This case gave them a trained fighter pilot with combat experience, a second pilot in a separate aircraft describing the same object independently, a warship's advanced radar system that had already logged similar contacts for a week beforehand, and captured days later by a third pilot, Lieutenant Chad Underwood, an infrared video, later confirmed as authentic by the Department of Defense, showing an object with no visible wings or engines behaving in ways that don't match a standard aircraft's heat signature. That video, eventually nicknamed Fleur 1, will become the centerpiece of the public case 15 years later. And it's also the piece of evidence that opened the door to a very different kind of explanation, one that has nothing to do with alien spacecraft, and everything to do with how tricky it is to trust your own eyes and your own instruments when you're staring at a screen instead of the sky itself. Skeptical researchers, most prominently a video analyst named Mick West, spent years digitally deconstructing the Fleur 1 footage frame by frame. His argument centers on something called parallax, an optical effect where a distant object appears to move, rotate, or accelerate relative to its background, purely because of how the camera itself is moving, not because the object is actually doing anything unusual. Picture watching telephone poles fly past your car window on the highway while a mountain in the far distance appears to stay almost still. Same principle, different scale. West's analysis suggests that much of what looks like erratic, physics-defying motion in the video may actually be the tracking pod's gimbal correcting itself as it struggles to keep a distant, ordinary object, potentially a plane far in the background, centered in frame. Under this theory, the object's apparent rotation lines up almost exactly with documented movements of the camera's internal gimbal mechanism, and the dramatic final acceleration may be an illusion created by the camera simply losing its lock and stopping its tracking, while the object itself continues along an ordinary, unremarkable flight path. It's a compelling argument, grounded in verifiable data readable directly off the video's own display, but it's also one that the pilots who were actually there directly dispute. Fravor has repeatedly said that his account isn't based on the Fleur 1 video at all. He wasn't the one who filmed it, and it was captured on a different day by a different pilot. His description of the object's movement comes from what he and 3 other officers directly observed with their own eyes at close range during a live intercept, not from grainy footage viewed later on a screen. To this day, the two sides of that argument, trained eyewitnesses insisting on what they experienced firsthand, and analysts insisting the recorded evidence tells a more mundane story, have never fully reconciled. For over a decade, the story stayed almost entirely out of public view, filed away in Navy incident reports, and passed around quietly among aviation circles. That changed in 2017, when investigative reporting in the New York Times revealed the existence of a previously secret Pentagon initiative called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, established years earlier at the request of a former Senate Majority Leader with long-standing interest in the subject. Buried inside that reporting was the first public release of Fleur 1 footage. And for the first time, the Tic Tac case wasn't a rumor traded on internet forums. It was a documented incident, acknowledged, however cautiously, by the United States government itself. In the years since, the case has only grown in institutional weight rather than fading away. The Navy formally confirmed in 2019 that the released videos were authentic recordings from military systems, not fabrications, not hoaxes. In 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment on what the government now calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, acknowledging that a number of cases, including encounters consistent with the Nimitz reports, remained unexplained using conventional data. And in 2023, both Fravor and Dietrich testified before Congress, under oath, describing the same encounter they described privately for nearly 2 decades, an object with no visible means of propulsion, behaving in ways that neither of them, with a combined total of decades of flight experience, had ever encountered before or since. What makes this case so difficult to simply file away, in either direction, is the same thing that makes it so compelling to tell. It isn't a story with a villain, a victim, or a tidy resolution. It's a story about the limits of what advanced instruments, trained observers, and rigorous analysis can actually prove once you push right up against the edge of what's considered physically possible. If the skeptics are right, this is a story about how easily even elite, highly trained professionals can be fooled by an optical illusion married to a piece of complex tracking technology, a sobering lesson in how much we trust our sensors, and how rarely we double-check what they're actually showing us. If the pilots are right, this is a story about an object that outperformed every fighter jet in the United States military, using a form of propulsion that, 20 years later, still has no publicly known equivalent anywhere on Earth. Either explanation on its own is remarkable, and that's the part of this case that tends to get lost in the noise of the debate. Both possible answers require something extraordinary to be true. Either our understanding of how easily perception can be deceived needs serious revision, or our understanding of what's physically possible in the sky above our own coastline does. Commander David Fravor retired from the Navy years after the encounter, having flown some of the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal, in combat and in training for decades. He has said, publicly and repeatedly, that nothing in his career, before or since, compares to what he saw that afternoon off the coast of San Diego. Alex Dietrich has echoed the same sentiment, describing an experience she still can't fully categorize, despite going on to fly missions in actual combat zones in the years that followed. Neither of them has ever claimed to know what the object was. That, in the end, might be the most important detail in this entire story. The people with the most direct experience of the event are also the ones who have been the most careful never to overstate the conclusion. They don't claim it was extraterrestrial. They claim it was real. It was tracked on multiple independent systems. And it did something that neither of them could explain using anything they were trained to understand about flight. The Tic Tac wasn't the only encounter that week. It wasn't the last time the same group of pilots ran into something they couldn't explain. Chad Underwood, the pilot who eventually captured the Fleur 1 footage, flew a separate mission days after the initial intercept specifically to try to record whatever the Princeton's radar kept finding. He described his own aircraft's targeting system struggling to maintain a consistent lock on the object, as though something about it was actively resisting standard tracking. Those skeptics would later argue that struggling to hold a lock is exactly what you'd expect from an ordinary distant aircraft at the edge of a sensor's effective range, not evidence of anything unusual about the object itself. Years later, 2 additional videos from separate encounters, nicknamed Gimbal and Go Fast, would surface alongside the original Tic Tac footage, expanding the case beyond a single afternoon into a pattern of similar sightings involving Navy air crews over a period of months. Go Fast, recorded off the East Coast, appeared to show a small object skimming low over the ocean at extraordinary velocity relative to the water below. Skeptics pointed out that the object's apparent speed could be explained by its distance from a camera versus its height above the ocean surface. The same kind of parallax argument used against the original Tic Tac video, though pilots who reviewed the footage argued that explanation doesn't fully account for everything visible in the radar data captured alongside it. Gimbal showed an object appearing to rotate mid-flight, an effect Mick West attributed to the camera's own gimbal mechanism correcting itself, a claim that remains disputed by some of the aircrew who were present for the sighting. What ties all 3 cases together is the same fundamental disagreement that's defined the story from the beginning. Trained observers reporting one version of events and careful analysis of recorded data suggesting another. Neither side has ever produced something conclusive enough to fully settle it. And that unresolved tension is precisely why the case has held the attention of scientists, journalists, and lawmakers for over 2 decades, long after most UFO reports fade quietly into obscurity. When Fravor and Dietrich testified before the House Oversight Committee in 2023, they weren't there to argue for extraterrestrial visitors. Fravor was careful, as he'd always been, to describe only what he personally witnessed, an object with no visible means of propulsion that matched his aircraft's movements in a way nothing conventional should have been able to do. Dietrich, for her part, has said publicly that she's less certain than Fravor about exactly what she saw, an admission that, if anything, adds weight to both their accounts. A case built on inflated certainty will be far easier to dismiss than one built on 2 witnesses who don't agree on every detail, yet still describe the same fundamentally strange encounter. More than 20 years later, the object, whatever it was, has never been identified. No debris was recovered. No program has come forward to claim it. No foreign government has ever been definitively linked to it. The radar tapes from that week, according to several crew members who spoke publicly afterward, either went missing or were confiscated shortly after the encounter, and much of the surrounding data reportedly remains classified to this day, a detail that has fueled as much speculation as the sighting itself. What's left is a case file that keeps getting reopened by journalists, by scientists, by Congress, by skeptics determined to finally close it once and for all, and by pilots who were there who have nothing left to gain by continuing to tell a story that's brought them as much scrutiny as it has credibility. Somewhere off the coast of Southern California, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in November 2004, for trained military officers watched something neither the laws of aerodynamics nor the tools built to explain it have ever fully accounted for. Whether that gap gets closed by better instruments, a declassified answer, or something no one has considered yet, one thing about the Tic Tac case hasn't changed in 20 years. The physics still doesn't add up, and until it does, the silence around exactly what happened that day remains the loudest part of the story.